Christian Zionism. The American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who is a Southern Baptist and by all evidence a premillennial dispensationalist, said a few weeks ago, just before the current war of aggression of Israel and the U.S., that Israel owns all the land, has the right to all the land from the Nile to the Euphrates, based on, I think, a theologically dubious, but his reading of Genesis chapter 15. And based on that, there's a sense that in our world today, Israel has the right to all of this land. Israel's acting on that because part of the Israeli government is Jewish biblical Zionism now, which was not the Zionism of 100 years ago. All in all, read Yaakov. He knows all of this better than I do. So I turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Jeff just said, that among American troops that are engaged in the war against Iran, the same idea being propagated, the idea that they're bringing about the end of times, that Trump was anointed by Christ so that he can bring together all the exiles. I mean, all this rhetoric, and this is not only rhetoric, people honestly believe, because I saw the interview with the officially American ambassador in Jerusalem, even though I have doubts which country he really represents, Israel or the United States. He said very clearly that for him, there's a right, a biblical right, the God-given right to occupy all the land. And I think that it's very dangerous that in spite of the separation between church and state in the United States, federal troops are being indoctrinated in this way. But again, that's part of the general trend, as far as I can say, in American society these days.
And you know, very important American commentators have been talking about this. Just today, there was an email sent out by the Prime Group foundation in the U.S. that kind of monitors these religious strains inside the army. And Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson is a board member of that foundation. And he wrote, again, like an email warning everybody how dangerous this is, because it's not only the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, who kind of represents the Christian Zionist strain. It goes all the way into the ranks of the army, and that is highly dangerous. Yaakov, since you've looked at Zionism for so long, these two strains, Jewish Zionism, Christian Zionism, which one of the two is actually bigger? And why is it that the Christian version is so also by now entrenched in these different branches of the U.S. government?
Well, I'll quote Pastor Hagee, who is one of the leaders of Christian Zionists in the United States. And a few years ago, he said that there are 50 million Christian Zionists in the United States. There are 15 million Jews, including babies and old people like myself. And so you could see which group is bigger. And United States is not the only place where you have them. Christian Zionism is extremely well represented in Brazil, in Guatemala, in parts of Africa, in South Korea. So it's a very important political religious movement, whereas Jewish Zionism is splitting Jews. And as you know, just the most recent example in the election of the new mayor of New York, who is overtly anti-Zionist and very critical of Israel, about 1/3 of the votes came from Jews. So you could see that some people said, well, in spite of that. No, I wouldn't say it's in spite. It's because of that he got those Jewish votes. So Jewish communities are very much divided. And the more violence continues in West Asia, and Israel is the perpetrator and initiator of it, today you can't really deny it, even if you want to. Israel is losing Jewish support and, to a certain degree, Christian Zionist support. And that may explain why Netanyahu was in such a rush to start a war.
Please.
Yeah, I was going to add, again, based on Yaakov's teaching up to us, at the origins of Jewish Zionism, which is the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the main religious movements of Judaism in the United States and in Europe were generally against the Zionist idea. The Zionist leaders, most famously Herzl, were nationalist and secular, and they were propounding at that stage not a biblical cause, but a nationalist cause, that each nation, to protect itself, had to have its nation state. That was the idea of nationalism. Not that you are a nation living in, say, the Habsburg Empire or the Romanov Empire with the multi-ethnicity, but you needed your own state. And that was true whether you were Serbs or Croats or Czechs or Bulgarians or Slovaks and so forth. And that was the secular Jewish Zionist strain. The rabbis said no. And I think it's absolutely fascinating for me. I grew up as a secular American Jew, but definitely in the rabbinic style of Judaism, because basically, with my bar mitzvah and so forth, this was in the standard rabbinic tradition, though not in my own case, in my community, in a very religious sense. But in the rabbinic teachings, the idea of Judaism for roughly almost 2,000 years or 1,900 years is live where you are, obey God's commandments, behave, don't make too much mess, and you don't go back to the Holy Land or the Promised Land. That's for the Messiah to determine. That's something you can remember in your prayers or your festivals during the year, but not something that was an actionable political agenda. And in the United States, we had several religious movements, a so-called reform movement, the least of the religious, to Orthodox Judaism, to something in between, the way that I was raised in conservative Judaism. But all of these strains, at one point or another in the early 20th century, said, no, this is not us. Israel or the Holy Land or whatever, we're Americans. And even when the Balfour Declaration was issued to create a Jewish homeland under the auspices of the British Empire, which didn't yet have control over the land that it was promising, a typical British maneuver. But in any event, even when that happened, there was one Jew in the cabinet who wrote, "I'm against this. I'm British. I'm not. This isn't my homeland. My homeland's British, and this is going to create a mess because I don't want to be called, a nationalist of some other country. My nation is British." And so this Zionist movement was not what it is portrayed today as the great cause of the Jewish people. Quite different from this.
if I may interrupt and add,
No, you definitely should.
Montague, who wrote this Jewish member of the British cabinet, titled his letter protesting against the Balfour Declaration, "Accusation of the British cabinet in anti-Semitism." He accused them of anti-Semitism.
For being Zionist.
For being Zionist, because this is something which today appears as an oxymoron. It isn't, because even Herzl wrote in his diary that anti-Semites will be our best friends and allies. And again, if you look at it dispassionately, if I may say so, anti-Semites want to get rid of the Jews wherever they happen to live, and Zionists want to bring them to Palestine. Their interests combine. And it's not a coincidence that, say, during the 1930s in Germany, Zionists established very much a sort of cooperation with the Nazi authorities who wanted to get rid of the Jews, and the Zionists were trying to show that Palestine is a good place for Jews to go. So we have a lot of evidence, and my book doesn't have illustrations, but there was an episode which I think is very important. There's an Israeli film called The Flat, and it shows, the story is about an SS official in 34, 35, visiting Palestine in the company of the chairman of the Zionist Federation of Germany, and writing wonderful articles in the SS newspaper. And on the occasion of that visit, a medal was coined with a swastika on one side and the Zionist symbol of the six-shaped star on the other. So it's part of history. And today, when it's very interesting, a colleague of mine has observed, if 100 years ago someone said to a Jew, you don't belong here, you belong to Israel, he would be considered anti-Semite. Today, for some strange reason, when someone says, well, I have nothing to do with Israel, I'm American, oh, no, you're anti-Semitic, you are denying the right of Jewish people for self-determination. So you have a very interesting inversion of what anti-Semitism is, and I think, incidentally, it's very dangerous.
You know, the camouflage.
And just as, if I could add, with Montague in this very amazing letter that he wrote, just to say, I had the same absolutely gut revulsion when Israel revised its basic law in 2018 and declared that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And my reaction was, how dare you? How dare you say this? I'm not a citizen of Israel, and you are not my country. I'm a U.S. citizen. And so the presumptuousness of it was felt by Jews, and it was actually the original reaction, and I think it's becoming the main or a very prominent reaction again today.
Well, and the danger of it, as you could see, are episodes which unfortunately are more and more numerous of attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions because of what Israel is doing. Of course, some Jewish Zionists contribute to that. They put up Israeli flags in front of their synagogues or in front of their Jewish institutions. They say, we stand by Israel. Well, in this case, you can expect this kind of reaction, not that anyone should condone them, but a lot of people who are appalled by what Israel has been doing don't find a more acceptable way of protesting than this violent way of, we just saw recently in Michigan, particularly in the very violent culture, if I may say so, of American society.
May I just ask, because the intention is also maybe in the last 15 minutes to also talk a little bit about the trajectory of Zionism and where you too see this movement or these movements. It's more than one. It's at least two strains, right? And I know, Yaakov, you also differentiate within Israel other strains that are non-Zionist. But if we look at these two strains, where you think they're going, and maybe to Jeff first, there's a lot of talk, and John Mearsheimer, of course, wrote this very important book about the Jewish lobby, right, and about AIPAC. The Zionist, the Israel lobby. So the thing is, like, if we differentiate between these two strains of Zionism and between the people lobbying for Israel, I mean, who is actually lobbying for Israel? Who is the lobby? Is it the Christian Zionists foremost, the Jewish Zionists? Is it the Israelite, like, nationalists? What do you see, and where do you see it going? First Jeff, and then Yaakov.
Well, I think
just to say, I think. Oh, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say American politics should be understood as interest group politics, and American politics it has created a methods of state capture. So the American political system is spend a lot of money and you get to set the policies in your sector. It's an incredibly corrupted system. If somebody, and let's hope they will be, writes political science textbooks of the 22nd century, just like we read as school kids about the rotten boroughs of Britain, and you shake your head, and how could you have a parliament that was owned essentially by one landlord or one aristocrat or so forth. We have a very corrupt political system, legalized corruption in its way, big money, big influence. And so you ask, well, what is this Israel lobby or the Zionist lobby? It is actually a mix of a number of things. Partly, it's directly the penetration of Israel into U.S. politics, because there's a lot of Israeli money and effort, period. I'm pretty much convinced that Epstein was a Mossad agent, for example, and was definitely an Israeli asset operating in the United States. Okay, there still are doubts about that, but I don't have them. I don't have many of them. I think that this was pretty clearly somebody being used by Israel. And the evidence for that, by the way, is not only the circumstantial evidence that Ehud Barak, who had been the head of military intelligence, was his big buddy, but the fact that Epstein was representing himself all over the world as making deals on behalf of Israel. And if he was freelancing, the Israelis would have stopped him, believe me. They didn't stop him. So the fact is he was operating at someone's behest. Okay, that's an example of direct Israel influence. Then there's big Jewish money, and there definitely are Jews that are Zionists, and there definitely are billionaire Jews that are Zionists, and they put a lot of money into this, just like there are a lot of us who are not billionaire Jews who are not Zionists, and especially are repulsed by what Israel is doing right now. So if it's today's Zionism, my God, no way. So this is a second strand that is definitely important, and it's important because these are very influential. Miriam Adelson, who is the widow of Sheldon Adelson, a big casino magnate, she definitely has influence. It's hundreds of millions of dollars given to Trump. And if there's one thing that Trump loves above anything else, it's money. It probably is his number one deep love. Even more than hatred and other things. So she's definitely influential. He calls her out on occasions. Miriam, how am I doing? He's completely with his eye on the money. And there's other big money involved that own, they had to take over TikTok because TikTok was showing images from Gaza. And so Larry Ellison of Oracle, for his son, buys TikTok. This is part of the lobby for sure. Then there is the Christian lobby side. That's also not only a lot of votes, by the way, because it's maybe 30 to 40% of Trump's voter base, so it's not small. That evangelical Protestant Christian Zionism, but it's also money. These mega churches are big money. Hagee, who Yaakov mentioned, he raises money for Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz perhaps could care nothing about Israel, but he cares about Hagee. And Hagee finances him, and Ted Cruz puts influential people into the National Security Council and elsewhere that are basically, some are even dual citizens, literally Israeli citizens and U.S. citizens, handling the Mideast portfolio in the U.S. government. So the U.S. is a very porous politics. It's completely interest group, sold to the highest bidder. I'm sure if the Arab world got together and made an Arab lobby and put in 10 billion rather than 2 billion, they could probably buy a lot of U.S. politics. I'm not recommending this. I hate the American political system the way it is right now, but it is not so hard to buy. And I'll just end by one note. Our politicians are incredibly cheap. They really are cheap. We're a $30 trillion economy. We are many trillions of dollars of GDP. We're a $1.5 trillion war machine. And yet a few hundred million is often enough to buy control over your preferred sector. So it's quite a bizarre operation. The American people are against all of this. They're against this war. They're siding with Palestine over Israel. But so far, money speaks louder.
Yeah, and if you put it like that, you get a good bang for your buck in the United States.
That's it.
Unfortunately. But Yaakov, if you want to react to that and maybe also give us your kind of guess of where Zionism as a political movement is going.
Well, I think Zionism has been moving from the ostentatious left, because it used to be very socialist, kibbutz and all that, to fascist right. And this has nothing to do with the personalities involved. I think this is a very natural evolution of a political movement, which is based on discrimination, on ethnic nationalism. And here it's important to distinguish between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, because in the system of ethnic nationalism, just like in anti-Semitism, you cannot change your characteristics. In other words, either you belong or you don't belong. You cannot change it. And I would say that violence that we've observed in the Middle East, in West Asia for the last 80 years is largely connected with Zionism. Not entirely, but largely, because you have to control the population that is naturally unhappy. You displace it, you exile it, you discriminate, you now submit it to genocide. Of course, they're not going to be happy. Of course, there will be resistance. But this resistance is not considered by Israel as legitimate and as logical in a way. But they try to dress it as anti-Semitism. I would say that if China had invaded Palestine, you would have exactly the same reaction. Or the Swiss decided to invade Palestine, you would have anti-Swiss sentiment. So I think that all of this has to be spelled out. And, well, if I may, my other little book that Jeff referred to about Jewish rejection of Zionism. You see, this is really important to understand that what is happening among Jews is also logical. I would say, well, I don't have sociological data, but the higher the income of the Jew, the more Zionist he's likely to be. And that's why you have Adelsons and others. And it may have nothing to do with the Jewishness, but there is another very important group that is part of the lobby, the arms manufacturers. Israel is very important both as a consumer and as a producer of arms. And there's very close connections between the American and Canadian, incidentally, armed producers and Israel. So, and these are very important parts of society because it's one of the wealthiest sectors of economy. So the evolution of Zionism in the direction of fascism is perfectly predictable. And I would say that it certainly is not Bibi Netanyahu or Smotrich or Ben Gvir who are also very much mentioned in among those who say, well, how horrible these people are taking Israel in the wrong direction. I wouldn't say so. I say that they represent, they embody that trend towards fascism, which had been there from the beginning.
And then maybe we have to be mindful of time. Jeff, if you want to take 2 minutes to give your kind of concluding thoughts, and then the final 2 minutes go to Yaakov.
Excellent. Very briefly, this point that Yaakov made about the reaction of the Palestinians and the reaction of co-religionists in the Arab world was that resistance formed, and basically since 1996, when Netanyahu first became prime minister, he brought along with his American advisors the clean break doctrine. The clean break doctrine says that Greater Israel will control all of Palestine. There will never be a Palestinian state. But more importantly, even that in response to resistance movements like Hamas or Hezbollah or others, Israel's response will be to overthrow the governments in the Middle East that support those resistance movements. That's Netanyahu's insight. Don't fight the resistance, fight the governments that back them. So Israel has been on a war spree since 1996. And Wesley Clark famously told us about the 7 wars that the U.S. would fight. These are basically U.S.-Israel wars. And that list included Libya, Sudan, Somalia, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And here we are. We've had several Iranian small wars. This is supposed to be the big one. So this is the logical effect also. You abuse your colonial settler, you push aside the local population, there's resistance, that resistance has its allies regionally, and you end up in regional war. And this is the disaster.